People think that it's easy to give away money. Not. The easy solutions to these challenges may be elusive, but we hope that you'll leave Detroit better prepared with both practical ideas and resources that you can use to improve your own effectiveness.
Has there been change with respect to foundation performance assessment? And we saw that, in fact, foundation CEOs thought that progress had been made and were tapping into more different kinds of data sources to assess performance than had been the case a decade before.
The majority of CEOs, when we asked, how much progress do you believe has been made to date collectively by the various organizations working toward the same key goal as your organization, believe that only moderate progress has been made. 25% believe a lot of progress has been made, and almost the same percent believe only a little progress has been made. When we ask CEOs about the contribution their foundation has made to progress, that's a different story. 60% of CEOs believe their foundation has contributed a lot to the progress that's been made. The work foundations are doing is too important for CEOs not to have as thorough and as accurate an understanding as possible of the progress being made on issues toward which their foundations are devoting resources. If foundations aren't aware of what has worked, and if they might be following paths that others have already realized do not work, then are they being as effective as they can be? And are they making as much progress as they could be?
Just as major corporate leaders need to watch arrogance, I think we as foundation leaders need to do the same. I thought the information was really helpful because it's sort of a check. It's a check to say, hey, we think we're pretty good. Let's make sure that's true, and sort of watch that arrogance.
That, we thought we had one relationship with our grantees, that we were communicating well, that we were being really responsive, and from that survey learned that for some of our grantees, they felt that we weren't being as responsive, and that we really weren't communicating in a way that valued the work that they were doing.
In a time of tight budgets, who wants to fund civic and community and resident engagement? To keep the community voice there. As everybody said, without it, we can't get very far, but it's not a direct service. It's an engagement strategy.
Sometimes philanthropy sort of communicates to itself, and whether it's our annual reports or just sort of the sense that we just want to sort of reaffirm that we're doing good, and the CEOs want to indicate how effectively they're behaving. I think we have to figure out, what is it that we're trying to communicate first? Is it just a feel-good story, or is it a investable proposition story, or is it a learnings story? And then I think you end up tailoring the kind of communication you want to do to what you want to achieve. But
I think there are two things. One is making a decision about how to protect your reputational capital so that we don't get out there and make errors that really have an effect on the foundation's reputation and influence. The second thing is change is really hard, and people aren't always ready for change and the consequences of it, and getting that across to internally is difficult.
You're in the planning mindset, you're thinking all about in terms of expected value up front. What can you expect based on what you know already in order to be able to project an outcome? When you're in the more entrepreneurial mindset of experimentation and discovery, you think in terms of what you can afford to lose. Okay, so affordable losses versus expected gains. Now, culture obviously always starts at the top, and then he encouraged people to try things, and in P&G reviews, they were asked, instead of just what did you do well, what did you try that you learned from? Amazon does the same thing. And so I think it gets deep into the incentives and what we measure that allow people to feel like, oh, okay, I can spend maybe 5 to 10% of my time trying things, making experiments, and being rewarded for being imperfect. it's not failure if it's a little bit. It's just being imperfect. Right?
Easy to say. It's easy for us to say, and it's actually not easy because it doesn't happen a whole lot. But it's easier for us to say we should allow our failures,
Right.
but then to say we're actually going to invest in innovation and experimentation among nonprofits and let them fail and have that entrepreneurial experience is a much bigger mountain to climb, I think, for our field.
But doable, don't you think? I mean,
certainly doable.
this field, just the bar of failure is so high that we can just reduce that to a point where there's learning experimentation going on. I think people within foundations are going to be happier, and I think the grantees are going to be happier. And it will lead to insights that only you guys can produce, and opportunities only this field can produce.
Now, it wasn't until I got involved in education that I heard about the cardiac test. See, I've heard about T-test, I've heard about F-test, I've heard about joint F-test. I never heard about the cardiac test till I got involved in education, right? And after Eli Broad contacted me, I decided to visit some schools just to, begrudge, just to flatter the guy. I'm gonna go visit some schools. And I walked in and someone says, "Professor, this after-school program is great. You ought to help us raise some money." I said, "Well, I'm not sure I'm any good at raising money, but how do you know it works?" And they looked me straight in the eye and said, "Can't you feel it in your heart?" That's the cardiac test. Doesn't work there, doesn't work here. And it's that kind of intuition that scares me, because education has a lot of intuition, of course, but our intuition can be exactly wrong. The crazy thing about this type of thing, not only do you have to find an answer to an incredibly complicated problem, you got to find one that people like. If we had found that there were 10 hospitals in the world who had cured cancer, we would all ascend on those hospitals and say, "Please teach us what you're doing." Right? We've got people dying over here. And when she told me that, like this light bulb went off, and I said, my God, in education reform, we don't do that. We say, "Wow, you have something that's phenomenally doing great things for poor kids?" Well, that's interesting. But our foundation's into technology. If we take data seriously, if we're honest with the data, and if we allow the data to shine through our own biases so that we don't say, "Well, I think this should work, so let me push and make sure it works," that's how we're actually going to make progress. Right? One step, one experiment at a time. I think foundations ought to be funding armies, not just soldiers. Because I think there are tremendous complementarities if people actually work together, and they never will if they don't have the incentive to do so. Right? The incentive now is to differentiate your product so that you can get more market share within the philanthropy. Not to come together and say, "Hey, you know what? Instead of coming to you as each individual organization, all 5 of us, here's our joint proposal, and we're going to solve a big problem." Right? And maybe that sounds crazy, but to me, as a grantee myself, there's no incentive to work with anyone else. And I think if this problem could be solved in a vacuum by one program, it'd be solved.
I believe that VC and corporate firms generally have a tendency to support innovation a lot more easily and more meaningfully than the philanthropic world. And I've also noticed that there are these insane expectations of folks that tend to do the work within the philanthropic world. And I think last but definitely not least, I don't necessarily think that we take care of the people who stick their necks out and really push the envelope and push for a great big idea that could be completely game-changing. I don't think we support that in any real way. My concern for our industry as a whole is that we're going to have a hard time attracting the best and the brightest to solve the biggest problems in the world, because the word is kind of out that we don't take care of our own. What kind of pipeline are we developing when we know that many folks look at this industry and see unhealthy, joyless people who aren't well compensated for their work and who are sometimes even punished for doing the good work? The idea that we can bring all of these type of things together to really beta test the best that's out there, look at the innovation and refine it in ways that we know can ultimately support the communities that we all care about. That's the important part of what we can do. We don't have to settle for that, but we cannot be comfortable in just looking only, at a list of measurable outcomes that only a funder really knows what they are. Let's really look at where are the great big ideas, how do we get them out there and support the people who have done and are doing the work so that they can continue to grow and we can continue to attract the best and the brightest that are out there, because we do need to save the world. Thank you.
The panel is focused on the funder side, what we can do as funders. And I'd like to start it off provocatively with a quote from David Hunter. And for those of you who know David, he does not mince words. And this comes from his book, Working Hard and Working Well. And I quote, "An admonishment to those funders who demand performance in which they don't invest, results for which they don't pay, and accountability from which they exempt themselves." Generally speaking, I think it's a fair criticism. It's still a case where you're going to have a rigorous management process in a culture that deals with continuous improvement, and know that it takes a lot of time to build this kind of greatness in organizations and fund it and support it and nurture it over time. And I do think that's how one builds great organizations today. And great organizations have disproportional impact. And if you want to have that impact through your money, then putting that money into that kind of long-term growth of organizations for that sustainability, that meaningful impact, I think that's the game.
That general operating raised the bar on trust. We did not have any track record that indicated that we would steward general operating dollars well. It was a brutal fact. And yet, they intervened and said, we're going to give this to you. And in the case of Robertson, they said, and we have one requirement: you cannot grow. What? Like, we've scaled hugely in the 90s. That's why people give us money. Nope. We actually want you to use this money to stabilize your operations. And they did not give us a lot of other requirements. So the expectation that you have for at-risk kids, of high expectations, they will rise to the occasion. So is our sector. Trust us, create high expectations, hold us accountable to driving our own quality impact. Super important.
Consolidation will be imposed by the forces I tried to discuss early on. It's going to happen because the pie of money will shrink, and the pressure for demand for performance in communities is going to grow. And when you look at that, something's got to give, folks. What bothers me about it is sometimes being driven by business people, and I'm one of those, and they don't understand the sort of the sensitivities and the complexities of the social interventions we have going on, and they'll make huge mistakes by driving a point of view on that. And I think one of the things we got to caution is we have to look at those consolidations constructively, thoughtfully about the people involved, meaning those being served, the institutions being served, because they're not businesses, they are nonprofits, and there's a difference. But that's where the foundation world can play a very constructive role about making sure that kind of thoughtfulness, that kind of sensitivity, that kind of understanding of the social complexity is understood by the people who are driving some of these actions.
And I think that when they're at their best, foundation CEOs are artful jugglers, with focus, clarity, and care, tending to their boards, the health of their organizations, and, of course, to impact.
Understand that we're enablers. We don't do the work. As enablers, we really need to understand the cultures, the overall culture of the communities in which we work, the key organizations in those communities, whether they're ones that we support or not. They may be government agencies. To understand the character and the culture of what we're working in, And if we have influence, it's a leadership from behind, and that's the hardest kind of leadership of all, because you really have to do it in solidarity. You have to do it in respect and trust and confidence.
And in a way, that's what I've been hearing a lot today, is the need, in a sense, for philanthropy to better understand multi-stakeholder groups, of which the foundation is only one stakeholder.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of issues for the future, that's certainly one I would want to understand better, especially.
What I've been wanting to work towards, however, is that it's a shared theory of change with the communities we work in. It's not when we say, okay, we've got our theory of change, now you carry out this part of it and we'll contract with you. So that is a big difference. I also think theories of change sound so academic sometimes. We really talk about, we have a hypothesis. There's a problem here. We think we have a solution. These are the organizations that are working on it. We have some financial wherewithal. We also have a voice. We also have connections that we can lend to the effort. So it's a sense of community engagement and alignment behind a shared theory of change, if